She said I was too predictable, but I was planning to propose at the lighthouse where we first talked about forever. I thought predictability meant reliability, something worth building a life around, until Jessica taught me the difference between being steady and being taken for granted. 3 years ago, I was just another 25-year-old wedding videographer in Richmond, Virginia, trying to build something meaningful with my camera and a decent work ethic inherited from my father who spent 30 years as a high school shop teacher. I'd found my niche capturing those unguarded moments between couples during their biggest day, the stolen glances and nervous laughter that made each wedding unique despite following the same basic script. My apartment was organized around my equipment and editing station, everything in its place because chaos and deadlines don't mix well when you're responsible for preserving someone's most important memories. I met Jessica on a Thursday night at Garden Grove Brewery, this local spot that served craft beer alongside decent burgers and hosted trivia nights that actually required some brain power. She was there with co-workers from the tax preparation firm where she worked, celebrating the end of another brutal filing season, and something about her laugh caught my attention from across the room. Not the forced social media laugh that most people my age seem to perfect, but something genuine that made me look up from the wedding footage I was reviewing on my laptop. Jessica had this way of making ordinary conversations feel important, asking follow-up questions about my work that showed she was actually listening rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. She worked as a tax preparer for middle-class families and small businesses, the kind of steady professional who helped people navigate their financial obligations without judgment or condescension. Our first real date was antiquing in Scottsville, something I'd never considered doing but found surprisingly engaging when Jessica explained the history behind different pieces and restoration techniques she'd learned from YouTube videos and library books. She had this ability to see potential in forgotten furniture and overlooked treasures, pointing out quality craftsmanship under layers of neglect and bad paint jobs that previous owners had inflicted. I started bringing my camera along on these weekend trips, initially just to document our adventures but gradually developing an appreciation for the stories these objects carried and the patience required to bring them back to life. Jessica's enthusiasm was infectious in the best way, making me slow down and notice details I usually overlooked in my rush to get the perfect shot or meet the next deadline. Her parents owned a small bed and breakfast called Magnolia House about 40 minutes outside Richmond, converted from a 1920s farmhouse that her father had been restoring room by room for the past 15 years. Tom and Linda Chen had bought the property as newlyweds with more ambition than experience, learning carpentry and electrical work through trial and error while raising Jessica and her younger brother in organized chaos of renovation projects. Tom taught high school chemistry for 30 years before retiring to focus on the bed and breakfast full-time, and he had this methodical approach to problem-solving that appealed to my technical mindset when editing wedding videos frame by frame. Linda handled the business side and guest relations with the same attention to detail she'd used as a nurse practitioner, making sure every visitor felt welcomed rather than tolerated. The first time Jessica brought me home for Sunday dinner, Tom showed me his workshop in the converted barn where he was restoring a 1940s dining room set that would eventually furnish one of their guest rooms. I found myself genuinely interested in his explanation of different wood grains and joining techniques, appreciating the precision required to repair damage without destroying the original character of each piece. Tom started inviting me to help with smaller projects, teaching me to use hand tools properly and explaining why certain restoration approaches worked better than others for different types of damage or wear patterns. These Saturday afternoon sessions became something I looked forward to more than most social obligations, working in comfortable silence punctuated by Tom's occasional stories about previous projects or Jessica's childhood adventures in the workshop. Linda would bring us coffee and homemade cookies around 3 o'clock, usually staying to offer her opinions about stain colors or hardware choices with the authority of someone who'd been living with Tom's projects for decades. Jessica seemed happy watching me learn from her father, often commenting that she'd never seen anyone pick up woodworking skills so naturally or show such genuine interest in the detailed explanations Tom enjoyed giving. I started documenting their restoration projects with my camera, initially just for my own reference but gradually developing ideas about creating a short film showcasing their work and the stories behind each piece they saved from neglect or disposal. The bed and breakfast guests often asked about the furniture history during their stays, and Linda mentioned that having professional video documentation might help them attract visitors interested in their restoration philosophy rather than just needing a place to sleep. Working with Jessica's family felt like discovering a different way of approaching life, where success meant creating something lasting rather than just meeting the next deadline or collecting the next paycheck from satisfied wedding clients. Tom's workshop became my refuge from the constant pressure of wedding season, where one mistake could ruin someone's irreplaceable memories and my reputation with them. Here I could practice new techniques without catastrophic consequences, learning to appreciate the slow satisfaction of fixing something broken rather than just capturing moments as they disappeared forever. Jessica loved seeing me engaged with her family's world, often joking that I was more excited about visiting her parents than spending time with her, which wasn't entirely untrue, though I never admitted that out loud. The four of us developed this comfortable rhythm of shared meals and collaborative projects, with Jessica and her mother planning antiquing expeditions while Tom and I worked through his growing list of restoration challenges in the workshop. I started thinking about proposing during our second year together, not because of external pressure or timelines, but because building something permanent with Jessica felt like the natural next step in our established pattern of creating things together. The engagement ring research began that fall, balancing my desire to choose something meaningful with Jessica's practical nature and her stated preference for vintage settings rather than contemporary designs from chain jewelry stores. I spent September visiting estate sales and antique jewelry dealers throughout Central Virginia, looking for the perfect vintage engagement ring while simultaneously scouting locations for my proposal plan at Cape Henry Lighthouse near Virginia Beach. The lighthouse held special significance for us because I'd filmed a wedding there the previous summer where Jessica had served as my assistant, and she'd mentioned during that shoot how romantic it would be to get engaged somewhere with such historical permanence and ocean views. I'd been quietly coordinating with the park service about accessibility and timing, planning to propose during the golden hour when the lighthouse would be perfectly lit for both the moment and the photos I intended to capture afterward. My research led me to a 1920s Art Deco setting with a modest but well-cut diamond from an estate sale in Williamsburg, exactly the kind of piece Jessica would appreciate for its craftsmanship and story rather than its size or obvious expense. However, around this same time, Jessica started mentioning Kevin Chin, no relation to her parents despite sharing the same last name, who had apparently transformed himself from a failed college musician into a successful real estate developer in Atlanta. Kevin had been Jessica's boyfriend during their sophomore year at Virginia Commonwealth University before dropping out to pursue his music career, leaving Jessica hurt and confused when he disappeared without explanation or contact information. According to Jessica's recent conversations with mutual college friends, Kevin had completely reinvented himself after his music dreams collapsed, earning his real estate license and building a property development company that specialized in converting historic buildings into luxury condominiums throughout the Southeast. She began bringing up Kevin's success story during our weekend antiquing trips, comparing his willingness to take risks and chase bigger opportunities with our more predictable lifestyle of steady work and weekend restoration projects. I noticed Jessica checking her phone more frequently during our antique hunting expeditions, scrolling through what I later learned were Kevin's social media accounts showcasing his company's latest projects and his apparently upgraded lifestyle. She started questioning whether we were becoming too comfortable with our routines, wondering aloud if there was more to life than weekend trips to estate sales and helping her parents with bed and breakfast maintenance projects. The conversations about our future together began taking on a different tone, with Jessica expressing concerns about whether we were settling for safe choices rather than pursuing something more ambitious or exciting. She mentioned Kevin's transformation story repeatedly, emphasizing how he'd taken control of his life after his music career failed and built something impressive through determination and strategic risk-taking. I found these comparisons increasingly uncomfortable, especially when Jessica started suggesting that maybe we should consider relocating somewhere with better opportunities, like Atlanta, where the real estate market was supposedly booming for people with vision and courage. Our Sunday dinners at her parents' house became tense affairs where Jessica seemed distracted and restless, checking her phone during her father's woodworking explanations and offering minimal input during discussions about upcoming restoration projects or bed and breakfast improvements. Tom noticed the change in Jessica's engagement level, asking me privately if everything was all right between us and whether she'd lost interest in the family business or our collaborative workshop sessions. I assured him that Jessica was probably just dealing with work stress from her busy tax season approaching, but internally I was beginning to recognize that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship dynamic. Jessica's enthusiasm for finding forgotten treasures and restoration projects had been replaced by a restless energy that made our established routines feel insufficient rather than comforting. She started criticizing our weekend plans as boring and predictable, suggesting that we should be doing something more meaningful with our time than visiting the same antique shops and estate sales we'd been exploring for 2 years. The engagement ring hidden in my sock drawer began feeling like a symbol of my failure to understand what Jessica actually wanted from our relationship, rather than the romantic gesture I'd planned so carefully. I postponed the lighthouse proposal twice, first because of weather and then because Jessica seemed increasingly distant and distracted whenever we discussed our future together. Her comments about Kevin's success and transformation became more frequent and pointed, making me wonder if she was comparing our relationship unfavorably to whatever potential she imagined might exist with someone more ambitious or financially successful. I started noticing that Jessica's responses to my ideas about expanding my videography business or potentially collaborating with her parents on promotional materials for the bed and breakfast lacked the enthusiasm and support she'd previously shown for my professional development. Instead, she would redirect conversations towards stories about Kevin's latest project acquisitions or his company's expansion plans, speaking about his achievements with an admiration that felt uncomfortably personal rather than casually appreciative. The October weekend when I'd originally planned to propose came and went without any romantic gestures, as Jessica seemed preoccupied with checking social media and responding to text messages throughout our trip to an estate sale in Charlottesville. I realized that the woman who had once been genuinely excited about discovering a 1950s dining room set or helping me document her father's restoration techniques had been replaced by someone constantly looking elsewhere for satisfaction or validation. The breakup happened on a Tuesday morning at our usual coffee shop, the same place where Jessica had once laughed at my terrible jokes about wedding photographers and their obsession with perfect lighting conditions. She'd texted me the night before asking if we could meet for coffee before work, which I assumed meant she wanted to discuss Thanksgiving plans with her parents or perhaps finally address the growing tension I'd been sensing between us for weeks. Jessica arrived looking composed but nervous, fidgeting with her phone and ordering her usual lavender latte while I stuck with black coffee and waited for whatever conversation she'd been building up to having with me. She explained that Kevin had reached out to her recently through social media, not romantically but because he was going through a difficult divorce and custody battle that was consuming his emotional energy and financial resources. According to Jessica, Kevin needed someone who understood his background and could provide objective support during this challenging transition in his life. Someone who knew him before his success and could help him navigate the personal costs of his professional achievements. She felt obligated to help him work through these problems because of their shared history and because she was one of the few people who remembered who he'd been before building his real estate empire in Atlanta. Jessica insisted this wasn't about romantic feelings but about friendship and moral responsibility, explaining that Kevin had specifically reached out to her because he trusted her judgment and valued her perspective on important life decisions. She needed to focus her emotional energy on supporting Kevin through his legal battles rather than continuing to build our relationship, which she described as having reached a natural plateau where we both felt comfortable but not particularly challenged or inspired. I sat there listening to her careful explanation, recognizing that she'd rehearsed this conversation and convinced herself that leaving me to support her ex-boyfriend was somehow a noble sacrifice rather than an obvious betrayal of our 3-year relationship. When she finished talking, I simply nodded and told her I understood her decision, then called for the check and paid for both our drinks without making a scene or asking the follow-up questions she'd clearly prepared to answer. Jessica seemed surprised by my calm acceptance of her announcement, perhaps expecting me to argue with her reasoning or beg her to reconsider choosing Kevin's problems over our established partnership. Instead, I told her I hoped everything worked out the way she wanted, gathered my things, and left the coffee shop while she was still sitting at our table looking confused by my lack of dramatic reaction to her carefully planned speech. I drove home in strange clarity rather than heartbreak, recognizing that Jessica had just revealed something fundamental about how she viewed our relationship and what she actually valued in life. Back at my apartment, I opened the sock drawer and stared at the engagement ring I'd chosen so carefully, feeling relief rather than devastation as I realized how close I'd come to proposing to someone who saw me as a comfortable placeholder rather than her actual choice. The ring represented all the assumptions I'd made about our shared future, assumptions that Jessica had just corrected by choosing to invest her time and emotional energy in someone else's drama rather than continuing to build something stable with me. I spent the rest of that day editing wedding footage and thinking about how I'd completely misread the situation, believing that Jessica's growing restlessness meant she needed more adventure in our relationship when she actually needed someone more ambitious and financially successful than a wedding videographer who enjoyed woodworking with her father. That evening, I called Tom and Linda to let them know that Jessica and I had ended our relationship, explaining briefly that she'd decided to pursue other opportunities without going into details about Kevin or her stated reasons for leaving. They both expressed genuine sadness and surprise, mentioning that they'd assumed we were heading toward engagement based on how integrated I'd become with their family projects and Sunday dinner traditions. Tom specifically said he'd miss our workshop sessions and hoped we could still be friends regardless of what happened between Jessica and me, which touched me more than I expected and confirmed that I genuinely connected with her family in ways that transcended our romantic relationship. I threw myself into wedding videography work with the focused intensity of someone who needed to rebuild his professional identity after having it intertwined with someone else's plans for 3 years. The autumn wedding season kept me busy documenting other people's happiness while processing my own relationship's ending, finding strange comfort in capturing genuine love stories that reminded me what authentic partnership actually looked like when both people chose each other completely. My work improved dramatically during this period, partly because I had more time to focus on creative techniques and partly because my recent experience with Jessica's departure made me better at recognizing and filming those unguarded moments when couples revealed their true feelings for each other. In December, I received an unexpected opportunity when a documentary producer from Charlotte contacted me about a feature film project documenting coastal restoration efforts along North Carolina's Outer Banks, work that would combine my technical skills with environmental storytelling on a much larger scale than wedding videos. The project focused on communities working to rebuild their shorelines after hurricane damage while preserving the natural habitats that made these areas worth saving, exactly the kind of meaningful work I'd been wanting to pursue beyond capturing reception dances and cake-cutting ceremonies. Riley Martinez was the environmental journalist coordinating media coverage for the restoration project, and she challenged my approach to storytelling from our first meeting at the production offices in Wilmington, where she questioned whether I understood the difference between documenting events and revealing their deeper significance. She had this direct way of communicating that reminded me of Tom's workshop instructions, pointing out technical problems or missed opportunities without making me feel defensive about my inexperience with documentary filmmaking. Riley pushed me to think beyond pretty shots and perfect lighting, encouraging me to focus on the human stories behind environmental data and scientific research that most people found boring or incomprehensible when presented in traditional formats. Working with her meant learning to see conservation efforts through the eyes of local fishermen, park rangers, and volunteer workers whose livelihoods depended on successful restoration rather than treating environmental protection as an abstract concept that looked good on camera. The documentary project required me to spend 3 weeks on location during January and February, filming interviews and restoration work while staying in small coastal towns that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with storytelling through video in the first place. Riley's journalism background brought credibility and depth to our collaboration that elevated my technical work into something more substantial than wedding highlight reels, even though I maintained respect for that work and continued accepting local bookings. Meanwhile, through mutual friends back in Richmond, I learned that Jessica's situation with Kevin was deteriorating rapidly as his supposed real estate empire collapsed under investigation for fraudulent investment schemes and illegal development practices. According to the updates I received, Kevin had been running elaborate Ponzi schemes disguised as luxury condominium developments, taking investor money for projects that existed only on paper while using new investments to pay returns to earlier investors. Jessica had apparently drained her savings account and maxed out her credit cards trying to help Kevin pay legal fees and maintain his lifestyle during the investigation, believing his claims that the charges were politically motivated attacks on his success. She'd also quit her tax preparation job to work full-time managing Kevin's crisis communications and investor relations, thinking she was supporting a legitimate business under temporary scrutiny rather than enabling someone who'd been defrauding people for years. The investigation revealed that Kevin's entire transformation story was fabricated, built on stolen investor money and fraudulent loan applications rather than legitimate business acumen or strategic risk-taking as Jessica had believed. When the federal charges were filed in March, Kevin immediately abandoned Jessica and disappeared, leaving her financially ruined and emotionally devastated while he fled to avoid prosecution for securities fraud and money laundering. Jessica lost her apartment, her car, and most of her possessions while trying to distance herself from Kevin's legal problems and rebuild her professional reputation after being associated with his criminal enterprise. She moved back in with her parents at the bed and breakfast, working as their unpaid assistant while dealing with the emotional trauma of discovering that everything Kevin had told her about his success and transformation was a complete fabrication designed to exploit her feelings and her money. Tom mentioned during one of our occasional phone conversations that Jessica seemed broken in ways that went beyond financial loss, struggling with the realization that she'd abandoned our genuine relationship to support someone who'd been using her from the moment he contacted her through social media. By April, I was splitting my time between North Carolina documentary work and Richmond wedding bookings, building a sustainable balance between meaningful projects and reliable income while developing a personal relationship with Riley that felt entirely different from my previous experience with Jessica. Riley appreciated my technical skills and creative instincts without needing me to prove my worth through financial support or lifestyle upgrades, treating our collaboration as a partnership between equals rather than a convenience arrangement that benefited primarily one person. The confrontation happened on a rainy Tuesday evening in late May when Riley was visiting my Richmond apartment to review footage from our latest North Carolina shoot and plan our summer filming schedule around hurricane season considerations. We were working at my dining room table with laptops and external hard drives spread across the surface when my doorbell rang insistently, followed immediately by aggressive knocking that suggested someone was either in crisis or looking for a fight. I opened the door to find Jessica standing on my front steps completely soaked from the rain, flanked by 4 friends holding smartphones pointed directly at me in obvious preparation for recording whatever scene they'd planned to create for social media content. Jessica looked terrible, much thinner than I remembered and wearing clothes that seemed too large for her diminished frame, her hair plastered to her head from the rain and her makeup streaked down her face in ways that made her appear genuinely desperate rather than strategically disheveled. She immediately launched into a screaming tirade about how I'd abandoned her during the worst period of her life, claiming that I'd known about Kevin's legal problems and deliberately withheld that information to sabotage her relationship and force her to return to me. According to Jessica's increasingly hysterical accusations, I'd somehow orchestrated Kevin's downfall through my professional connections in the wedding industry and then refused to help her financially when she needed support most, proving that I'd never actually loved her but only wanted to control her through money and manipulation. Her friends encouraged this performance with comments and questions clearly designed to escalate the drama while ensuring their phones captured every moment of Jessica's breakdown for whatever viral content they planned to create from this ambush at my apartment. I stood in my doorway listening to Jessica's accusations with growing amazement at her ability to rewrite our relationship history and her recent choices into a narrative where I was somehow responsible for Kevin's criminal behavior and her decision to financially support him. Riley appeared behind me after hearing the commotion, calmly observing the situation while Jessica's friends continued filming and encouraging her to make increasingly outrageous claims about my supposed sabotage of her life and happiness. When Jessica noticed Riley, her accusations shifted to include claims that I'd been cheating throughout our entire relationship and that Riley was proof of my dishonesty and manipulation, despite the obvious timeline problems with this theory given that I'd met Riley months after Jessica left me. Riley stepped forward and politely informed Jessica and her friends that they were trespassing on private property and that she was calling the police to report harassment and potential cyberbullying, pulling out her own phone to make the call while maintaining perfect composure. Jessica's friends immediately became less enthusiastic about filming once Riley mentioned police involvement and potential legal consequences for their planned social media harassment campaign, several of them backing away from my door and whispering among themselves about whether they should leave before officers arrived. I remained completely calm throughout this entire confrontation, refusing to engage with Jessica's attempts to provoke an emotional reaction that would validate her narrative of being wronged by someone who owed her ongoing support despite her choice to leave our relationship. Instead, I told Jessica that I was sorry she was going through difficulties but that her problems with Kevin were not my responsibility and that showing up at my apartment with cameras was inappropriate and potentially illegal. Riley finished her call to the police and informed everyone that officers were on their way to address the trespassing and harassment situation, suggesting that Jessica and her friends might want to consider leaving voluntarily rather than waiting to explain their behavior to law enforcement officials. The group began arguing among themselves about whether they had enough footage for their social media purposes and whether continuing this confrontation was worth potential legal consequences, with Jessica becoming increasingly agitated as her friends lost enthusiasm for supporting her dramatic scene. When she realized that neither I nor Riley was going to provide the emotional breakdown or defensive reactions her friends were hoping to capture on video, Jessica made one final attempt to provoke a response by claiming that I'd ruined her life and that she hoped I was satisfied with destroying someone who'd only wanted to help a friend in need. The police arrived within 15 minutes and immediately requested to see any available security footage from my apartment building, which fortunately had recently installed cameras in the hallway and entrance areas that captured Jessica's arrival and the entire confrontation from multiple angles. The officers reviewed the footage on my laptop while Jessica and her friends waited outside under the building's awning, their confidence noticeably diminishing as they realized that video evidence would contradict whatever story they'd planned to tell about being victims of harassment or intimidation. The security recordings clearly showed Jessica and her group arriving with phones already positioned to record, undermining their potential claims of spontaneous emotional distress or defensive reactions to my behavior during the confrontation they'd obviously planned and orchestrated. After reviewing the evidence and speaking with both Riley and me about the events leading to this incident, the officers escorted Jessica and her friends away from my building with formal warnings about trespassing and harassment, explaining that any future contact would result in restraining order applications and potential criminal charges. The irony of the situation became apparent over the next few days as Jessica's friends posted their footage online, expecting sympathy and viral support for their harassment campaign, only to receive overwhelming criticism from viewers who recognized the obvious setup and Jessica's manipulative behavior throughout the recorded confrontation. Comment sections filled with people pointing out the contradictions in Jessica's story, questioning why she'd brought multiple camera operators to what she claimed was an emotional breakdown, and criticizing her attempts to blame someone else for consequences of her own choices to support a criminal ex-boyfriend. The social media backlash was swift and brutal, with viewers sharing the videos as examples of entitled behavior and manipulation tactics rather than supporting Jessica's victim narrative as her friends had clearly expected when they planned their harassment campaign. Within a week, Jessica had deleted all her social media accounts and apparently moved back to her parents' bed and breakfast permanently, unable to handle the public criticism and mockery that resulted from her friends' poorly planned attempt to create viral content from our confrontation. According to Tom, who called to apologize for his daughter's behavior and express concern about potential legal consequences, Jessica was seeking therapy and rehabilitation services to address what he described as a complete emotional breakdown following the Kevin situation and its aftermath. He explained that Jessica had finally acknowledged her role in choosing to leave our stable relationship for someone who'd been manipulating and exploiting her, though this recognition came too late to repair the damage to her finances, career, and mental health. Riley and I decided that Richmond held too many complicated memories and professional limitations for the kind of work we wanted to pursue together, leading us to relocate to Asheville, North Carolina, where we could focus on environmental documentary projects while building a sustainable creative partnership. The mountain town offered better access to conservation stories throughout the Southeast while providing a fresh start away from Jessica's ongoing drama and the wedding industry connections that had defined my previous professional identity in Virginia. I opened a small studio specializing in wedding and documentary filmmaking, working with couples who appreciated authentic storytelling over elaborate productions while continuing to collaborate with Riley on environmental journalism projects that combined her research skills with my technical expertise. The business model allowed us to maintain financial independence through reliable wedding bookings while pursuing more meaningful documentary work that addressed climate change impacts and community conservation efforts throughout the Appalachian region. Riley established herself as a freelance environmental journalist working with regional publications and national magazines, building a reputation for making complex scientific research accessible to general audiences through compelling human interest stories. Our personal relationship developed naturally alongside our professional collaboration, built on mutual respect and shared creative goals rather than financial dependence or lifestyle expectations that had characterized my previous experience with Jessica. We bought a small house outside Asheville with enough land for a workshop where I could continue the woodworking skills Tom had taught me, creating furniture pieces that complemented Riley's vintage decorating aesthetic and provided a meditative counterbalance to our demanding filming schedules. The transition to North Carolina represented everything Jessica had claimed to want during her restless period: adventure and professional growth and financial opportunity, but achieved through genuine partnership rather than abandoning someone who offered stability and support. 2 years later, Riley and I have built something genuine in our mountain community, creating honest work that documents local weddings and conservation efforts without the drama or manipulation that characterized my previous relationship experience with Jessica. Our documentary projects focus on Appalachian communities addressing climate change impacts through traditional knowledge and innovative conservation techniques, stories that combine environmental science with human resilience in ways that actually matter to viewers rather than serving as social media content. I've learned to appreciate the quiet satisfaction of filming couples who choose each other completely, recognizing authentic partnership when I see it through my camera lens, and understanding how different genuine love looks from the conditional affection I'd mistaken for commitment during my 3 years with Jessica. Riley and I work as equals, sharing creative decisions and financial responsibilities without keeping score or maintaining hidden agendas about who owes what to whom, building our relationship on mutual respect rather than convenience or lifestyle expectations. Our wedding clients appreciate our documentary approach to their celebrations, capturing unguarded moments and genuine emotions rather than staging elaborate productions designed primarily for social media presentation, work that feels meaningful because it serves couples who actually value authentic storytelling over impressive visuals. The mountain town provides exactly the kind of balanced lifestyle I'd been seeking without realizing it, combining professional fulfillment with personal contentment in ways that don't require constant validation or dramatic gestures to maintain satisfaction. We've developed relationships with local conservation organizations and environmental research groups, creating ongoing documentary projects that document successful restoration efforts while building our reputations as filmmakers who understand both technical excellence and environmental storytelling. Riley's journalism background continues complementing my technical skills, resulting in collaborative work that neither of us could achieve independently while maintaining the individual creative identities that make our partnership sustainable rather than codependent. I still occasionally hear updates about Jessica through Tom, who mentions that she's slowly rebuilding her life through therapy and part-time work at the bed and breakfast, though she remains financially and emotionally fragile years after the Kevin situation destroyed her savings and professional reputation. According to these updates, Jessica has acknowledged her mistakes in leaving our relationship and expressed regret about her choices, though Tom emphasizes that she understands any possibility of reconciliation ended permanently when she organized that harassment campaign at my apartment. I feel genuine sympathy for Jessica's ongoing struggles without feeling responsible for fixing problems she created through her own decisions, recognizing that her situation serves as a reminder of how destructive it can be to abandon genuine partnerships for relationships based on fantasy rather than reality. Riley and I have discussed marriage as a practical next step rather than a romantic gesture, planning a small ceremony that reflects our actual values and relationship rather than creating elaborate productions designed to impress other people or generate social media content. Our shared future feels solid because it's built on daily choices to support each other's goals and creative work rather than expectations about lifestyle upgrades or financial security that someone else should provide. The woodworking shop behind our house has become my refuge for processing creative challenges and maintaining the meditative practices Tom taught me during those Sunday afternoons in his workshop, skills that continue serving me well when I need perspective on professional or personal decisions. We've learned that healthy relationships don't require constant drama or excitement to remain satisfying, finding contentment in shared creative pursuits and the predictable rhythms of small-town life that Jessica had criticized as boring but which actually provide the foundation for sustainable happiness and meaningful work.